Hello and welcome to UiPath Community Tutorials Enhanced Robotic Enterprise Framework. My name is Rajaneesh Balakrishnan. I am an UiPath MEP. In this tutorial, we will take a deep dive into a template called Enhanced RE Framework, which is an upgraded version of RE Framework that comes by default with UiPath Studio. If you have used this RE Framework before, it will be a cakewalk for you. Otherwise, don't panic. Still, you can go ahead and use this enhanced RE framework directly. My main objective of this tutorial is to give you an overview of enhanced RE framework by implementing in a really simple project so that you can understand all the advanced concepts such as state transitions, try catch, the work blocks, and how to work with exception handling and logging messages so that you can implement all these concepts in your own projects easily. As part of this tutorial, we will be going through these 8 steps today to understand this framework better, starting from downloading the template to debugging, testing and running the project. Within that, we will resolve any dependencies issues that we come across, and we modify the project name in certain files and sections. Also, we will be creating a couple of workflows that are specific to our business processes. Today we will be dealing with a project called a currency conversion, where we will be working with multiple Excel files, desktop application, web application and Orchestrator, so that we read data from the Excel file and read and write data to Orchestrator and handle this data transfer mechanism within the framework. Between these steps, I will be explaining few concepts such as try catch block, state transitions, work blocks, etc. And finally, I will be giving you a demo on the completed project. The first one is to download the framework from the GitHub, for which I will go through this link to download. So that I can download the enhanced RE framework. The download button is at the bottom of this page. Click on the download. Now that the project is downloaded to my local, I'm going to extract this file and then copy this extracted folder to my project folder. Now I'm going to modify this to my project name. Let us check the framework. The first thing you will notice is the compatibility warning for this project. So when you click on continue, it will try to auto resolve. If not, you have to do it manually. We will come across few issues like this. So it says that UiPath vision.co has version incompatible, so that I have to resolve this. So you click on the manage packages. On the UiPath.UI automation.activities, click on the update. Which resolves the issue. And let us check if there is any more dependencies error. So when I click on the framework the get app credentials, which is used to communicate with the orchestrator to get the credentials, has some issue. To fix this, click on the manage packages and check if the project, if the package get credentials is there, which is missing. So I need to search for that credential, which is UiPath dot credentials dot activities. If I install this, the dependency will be resolved. Now, now that the issue is resolved, so if you come across any other dependencies, you need to resolve it accordingly by installing the correct package. Now that we have completed the first two steps, we are moving on to the third step, which is modifying the project name. The first is the project.json file, where I am going to change the description and the name to, from the enhanced framework, I'm going to change this to our project name. So the currency conversion is our project name. The one more place to change the project name is the config file in the log of underscore business process name, and the orchestrator queue name I changed to decision. In the credentials, I leave it blank, and in the tasks, it is default value. And in constants, these are the technical settings. So instead of hard coding the read, rise, timeout, delay, we give it in the config file so that we can improve the performance and treat it as a global variable. And in the assets, we have one asset, which is the Excel file, which we will be sending to the orchestrator. Now that we are done with the first three steps, it's time to move on to the fourth step, which is to create all required workflows specific to our business. So before we automate anything, it's essential that we understand the business that we are going to automate. I'm going to deal with a desktop application called WUI. This application basically expects three inputs: cash in, honest check, not honest check, to get the total deposit amount, which is $3. And the transaction ID is also generated. So we copy the total deposit and transaction ID to this Excel, which has all the data inputs required for the desktop application and the web application. So we use the source currency and the converter currency to the web application. The cash in, honest check, and not honest check to be transferred to the desktop application. In this example, I give $3 and the transaction ID to here. And with the total converted amount, I launch Google to create a transaction. In this case, USD to AUD. So I clear the source currency value before I enter my values and copy the converted amount to this Excel. Similarly, I need to create for all the transactions. Now I clear this value for the robot to create these transactions. So it's time to make minor modifications to the framework template. As a first step, on the process layer, I create two folders specific to my applications. One is for the desktop application and another is for the web application. So I name currency converter for the web application, and for the desktop application, I name it as WUI. And after creating these folders, I will be creating transactions. That is, I'll be creating the workflow sequences just to record the transactions and run these sequences individually to make it work perfectly with some hard-coded values. So for the WUI, I name this sequence as deposit transaction, and start creating the workflows. In the meantime, I'll be working on creating these workflow sequences to ensure these are working fine individually without any issues. That is, it should work independently. Now I name this as a convert currency for the web application, which is Google. So I have created this double UI and the currency, convert currency. So if you see the deposit transaction, I give the cash in honest check and not honest check and pass in the hard-coded values for time being to check if it is working as a independent workflow without any issues. And I get the message box just to see if it is working fine. So I use a variable called var total and transaction ID just to save the total amount and transaction ID. And finally, I click on the accept button just to accept the transactions. So once this is recorded, it's time to run the deposit transaction to check if it is working fine. So now I am going to click on the run button and see if it is working. So the application, the framework, it's not connected to the framework. So as a deposit transaction, it opens the WI and do the transaction. You can see the output is working fine. I'm getting the transaction and the total deposit and clicks on the accept button. So now I move on to the convert currency. So I am first of all this particular workflow expects the Google to be open because I'll be attaching to the window, and the default screen should be google.com. It will be expecting this text box to input the amount. Sorry, the input the text that is AUD to USD. So this is the hard-coded value which will be coming from the orchestrator once the framework is connected. So I'm clearing the field and entering the source currency value, and I'm extracting the converted value and storing it in a variable, and then I give it as a message box to check if the extracted value is working fine. So I give this extract converted value and save it in variable. And finally, I navigate to the google.com. So the variable name is var converted value. And once these steps are recorded, so I run this workflow to check if it is working fine independently with the hard-coded values. So the value is extracted properly, and I have confirmed these two workflows are working fine independently without any issues. So once these are connected to the framework, the framework will take care of the values. It will input the values from the orchestrator and capture the value and store it to the orchestrator, which we will be seeing in the upcoming steps. Now to progress further with this framework, I log into my orchestrator to create the queues and assets. In the queue, I create the queue name as decision, and I leave the unique reference to yes, and the maximum number of retries to the default value. And I add the queues. Now the queue has been added as decision. As a next step, I will be creating the assets specific to my project. I have one asset, which is the Excel file that is decision_data that has all the inputs. So I create the asset name as decision_data and leave the type as text and give an appropriate description and the folder name in the text field. As a description, I give data inputs from currency conversion process and the folder name to be copied to the text field. So I have the folder name
copied. So it's good to create now. So I have created the assets. Now I need to update this value to the config file, the orchestrator queue name to decision, and the assets to the value I have created in the orchestrator, which is decision underscore data. Now we will update the workflows inside the framework. The first is the init all applications, where the framework expects all the applications to be opened. So I opened the desktop application as well as the web application inside the init all applications framework. So I indicate the WUI to launch, and I open the browser, that is the google.com, and give the URL as Google, and the preferred browser is Chrome. So I change the browser type to Chrome so that I have init all applications ready. I'll be checking if it is working fine. Now I click on the run button to see and confirm the applications are opened properly. So I have opened the applications. I'll be updating the close all applications, where I close the opened applications, which is the WUI as well as Google. So I indicate the close activity to the WUI, and I close the application, that is the browser, which is Google, and I name this activity appropriately as a best practice so that it is easy to identify in case of any failure. So let us check if it is working fine, and it works fine. When I check the output, I can confirm the close WI and the close browser worked properly. Now let us move on to kill process from the framework, where we use a PowerShell to write a small script, stop-process name and process name -force, which close the Excel in this example, which was running in the background. So we will make use of this script from the PowerShell to handle within kill all process workflow within the framework. So I point to the PowerShell and then perform the for each activity and handle all the applications that needs to be killed. So I create a variable by the name apps, and in the variables panel I give the variable type as a string of arrays and the default value to Chrome, WA and PowerShell, which are the three applications that we are using. And I will be handling this type into activity in the expression editor to handle the application name from the item.toString, and I force enter in the PowerShell window. Now that I have modified this expression, I am running the workflow to check if all the applications are killed properly. So it's run successfully, and let's check the output to confirm all the applications are killed. As we have completed the first 4 steps of the roadmap, it's time to understand few most important concepts to connect the transactional processes to the Enhanced Robotic Enterprise Framework. The first one is the work blocks. The entire framework is a work block which has parent work blocks and child work blocks. The main is the parent work blocks, and the process transaction and get set transaction data are the child work blocks. Information from the parent to the child is passed using this work blocks concepts so that it is easy for debugging in case of any failure, and it supports effective logging of messages. Now in this example, the work block main.xaml is the parent work block where the work block name is main and the information related to work path are constructed, and any log fields are uh, added in the add log field section in the collection fields, where in this example the business process name is UiPath Enhanced Reframework. This will be changed in the child work block. In the process transaction, the work block name is process transaction. And in case of the successful process, the information related to the work blocks are constructed. For example, the fields that are captured from this child work blocks are passed on to the logged messages. And in the get set transaction data, the name is constructed along with log fields are also captured. Next is the try catch. Try catch are important for effective exception handling. The work block where an exception is expected is tried under the try block, and the exception is caught under the catch block. In case of a happy path, the try and finally will be executed. And in terms of a exception, the try, catch, and finally will be executed. So finally will be always executed. The entire framework is excellently exception handled using the try catch block. And if you see in this example, the main work block, within the main work block, the entire framework is exception handled, and each and every work blocks like process transaction and get set transaction data are also exception handled accordingly. The final one is the state transitions. The Enhanced Robotic Enterprise Framework uses state machine diagram and has 4 states: init, get set transaction data, process transaction, and end process. In the init state, the config dictionary variable is set to nothing by default, and then it reads the data from the config file to store it in the config dictionary to send it to the orchestrator. It performs cleanup operations. The robot initializes all the applications. The get set transaction data, the transaction item, which is a queue item, is set to nothing by default. Then it reads the data item from the orchestrator, also writes the transaction output to the orchestrator. In the process transaction, all the workflows related to the business process transaction are executed. Data is received as an input from the get set transaction data, and once the process is executed, the output is passed to the get set transaction data to write it to the orchestrator. Finally, in the end process, all the applications are closed and the execution comes to an end. With the states and related workflows, let us see how the workflows are mapped to the states. In the init state, the robot tries to perform all the cleanup activities and initialize all the applications. If it is successful, it moves on to the get transaction data to fetch the data from the orchestrator. If there is any system error and the max retry count is within the limit, it tries to initialize one more time. This is one of the significant difference from the previous enhanced reframework. And still if cannot recover, the robot moves on to the end program to finish the execution. In the get set transaction data, the data is read from the orchestrator for processing. In case of a successful transaction, it moves on to the process transaction. If it has completed reading all the transaction item, it moves to end program. Or if there is any issue reading the data, it moves to the end program. In the process, the actual business process transactions workflow are executed, and in case of a successful transaction, it writes the data back to the set transaction data. And in case of any business exception, the status is moved to failed and the business exception is handled accordingly. In case of any system error, and if within the maximum retry count, it moves back to the init state to try it one more time. Otherwise, it moves to the end program. And now let us see these concepts in action. To connect all the workflows together in the main page, create 3 log of variables: transaction ID, converted value, and total, mainly for logging purposes. And within the init state, we need to make minor modifications to read the assets and write it to the orchestrator. For that, we need a Excel application scope and a read range, and for each row, we read from the Excel from the item information collection. Add these items to read from the Excel and write it to the orchestrator. Now let us move on to the get set transaction data. In this workflow, there is not much change required, but make sure that get transaction item queue name is pointed to the config file orchestrator queue name by default. And also check the transaction item is the system variable IO underscore transaction item. Now let us move on to the process and make some modifications to connect our developed workflows to the process. For that, create a sequence and set it as a start node and name this sequence accordingly. In this example, it is deposit transaction and currency conversion. Move the deposit transaction and currency convert workflow within the sequence. Now I need to make minor modifications in the deposit transaction. I intend to change all the cash values to a round-off value, so I convert the double to a round-off using ceiling method, and then change all the hard-coded values to accept arguments. I have 3 input arguments and 2 output arguments. So the expected output arguments is the total amount and the transaction ID, var total and var transaction. And in the convert currency, I have 3 input variables, which is source currency, converted currency, and source value, which I pass it into the application to get the converted value. I just change all the hard-coded values into the arguments, and then I extract the output values and store it in the converted value. Now let us see on how do I pass the input and the output arguments in the deposit transaction and the convert currency. And in the process transaction successful work blocks, I will check whether the log of variables are passed correctly and the set transaction status is successful, and the collection variables are passed to the orchestrator so that the output will be displayed in the orchestrator along with the transaction ID and the converted value. And finally, if you want to save it in an Excel file, that is decision underscore data, we will use an application scope, and using the write cell method, we will be passed the variables to write it to the Excel. And one more step is I need to handle the exception. The catch work block on the exception, I handle the exception by assigning the total transaction ID and converted currency to error. Finally, I move the entire Excel application scope to the finally move the entire Excel application scope to the finally to handle the comments. Alright, now let us check for validation errors and analyze all the workflows. For that, click on the analyze file. I don't find any major concern or errors, so the framework is good for execution now. Welcome to the most exciting part, the demo. I'm logging into the orchestrator and creating the queue, deleting the queue and creating it once again for a fresh start. I'm making the unique references yes, and I don't want to auto retry in case of any failure. And then I go to the Excel file and make some modifications to the input data to consider some negative scenarios. In this case, I'm giving some invalid input so that I'm expecting a business exception. In the meantime, I have handled the business exception within the workflow so that it writes the message in the comment that it is invalid. So we are ready to start the execution now. So I go to the studio and run the main and see how it goes. I'm expecting the robot will close all the applications, so it is unable to find the Chrome. That's okay. It closes everything and opens the WI and Google, and at this time it fetches from the orchestrator the values and start giving into this application the first transaction number at this time, and it copies that total value and give it in the currency and get the converted and write it in the Excel. Similarly, it goes for all the transactions. So in the meantime, let us quickly do a small recap on what we have done so far. We downloaded the framework template and we modified the project name, resolved all the dependencies, and we understood the business processes, created workflows specific to our business process. We read data from the config file, we read data from the assets, pass on to the orchestrator. We established a connection to the orchestrator and read data inputs from the orchestrator to perform our transactional process. We modified our process to handle all the required workflows. We also debug, run, and test the workflow. I have also given you an overview of the enhanced Reframework. We saw how to conceptually work with work blocks, try catch, and state transitions. We also saw a few examples on exception handling and logging messages. And finally, we have successfully implemented our framework. Seems like everything is working fine now. So we will quickly review our results. So we can see the first row and second row got the total deposit and transaction ID. In the third row, if you see, I am specifically interested in the error. The total deposit transaction ID and total converted got the error. And similarly in the eighth row, the ABC data also got the error. I'll be seeing the comments. Yes, it got the business rule exceptions, which is good. And for ABC also we got the business rule exception. The provided input is invalid format. Now I will move on to the orchestrator to see how the output is passed from the framework to the orchestrator. In the decision, let me view the transactions and see one of the successful data. For the input values, the cash in, honest check, not honest check, source currency and converter currency, and the output logf underscore transaction ID converted value. So everything is successfully completed. And on the business exception, ABC, I can see the exception reason the provided input is invalid format. So we have completed for all the 10 transactions.
Thanks for watching this video and I hope you like it. Please provide your valuable comments. Thanks again and have a great day.